You are listening to the IFH Podcast Network. For more amazing filmmaking and screenwriting podcasts, just go to ifhpodcastnetwork.com.
The moment you say first-time filmmaker to an investor, it's you know that it's not what they want to hear. No one ever grabs you and says, "Oh, great, it's exactly what I wanted." First-time director to lavish my money on. And look, the same thing went for me, because after Flock of Dudes, I directed Urge, and I thought, having been in film for so long and having worked on big movies like Sin City, that being a first-time director would not be as much of a hindrance, but it still is, and really what it comes down to, and I understand it a little bit better now, is that before you direct, you really have no idea what kind of director you're going to be. You could hope, you can think, you can prepare, you can learn, you can watch movies, you can take classes, you can learn theory. All of these things are, which you should do, which is great, but none of them really prepare you for what it's actually like.
Hey everyone, thanks again for hitting that play button. This is another episode of the Dave Bullis Podcast. Before we get to today's episode, I just want to talk about the theme of today's episode, which is the Rodriguez list. We talk a lot about Robert Rodriguez and working with him, as Aaron Kaufman has worked with him in making Sin City 2 and Machete Kills. And I just want to say to you, for the people listening to this who are planning on making a movie or want to make a movie, here's what I would suggest you do. I would make 3 to 4 lists. One would be an asset list of all the props and sort of things that I might need. 2 is a location list, and 3 is an actors list. And if you want to make a 4th list, it would be a producers list, or maybe even just a very broad networking list of who you know and how you know them. Would they be willing to help you out by lending you a location for free? And if you take those lists, you start to brainstorm ideas of what you already have and things that are going to be easier to obtain than other things. And then you start to work through that, and you can start building a script out of that. What I think is going on is basically cinema now. One location cinema is sort of like the hallmark of this era. You look at movies that have come out like, Buried, ATM, Saw 1, The Green Room, Don't Breathe, and pretty much everything by the Duplass brothers and Blumhouse. It's all contained thrillers and horror. And, that's sort of because it's cheaper to do, and it requires such a focus on the story. Everything, including the actors, because they really don't hire named actors for these, but for most of them, they don't. But you could still, but the story has to take the focal point of all of this. And I think that's going to be the new calling card, by the way, is instead of a short film, you'll be showcasing like a feature-length film that you've made for cheap, that's also entertaining, and you've put onto YouTube for free, as a way to build an audience and to show what you can do. And, a producer or some kind of, money person sees potential in you, contacts you about working together, and then you can go from there, and then you can start getting bigger and bigger budgets. As I've told the story before with my friends with Lionsgate, and how they got their deal through with Lionsgate through YouTube. And, granted, things have changed since then, but the point is still the same. And, if you look at Fede Alvarez, who made that short film Panic Attack, he put it on YouTube, gained a ton of attention, and then he ended up directing the new Evil Dead movie, which came out in 2013. So my point being is, he just put that on YouTube for free, because he just, I'm assuming he wanted to gain some kind of attention, saying, hey, look what I could do, and that's what I think you have to do. I think the days of making sort of a film and entering into Sundance and all that stuff, I think that's probably going to happen later for everybody, myself included, because unless you already have a absolute stellar network and a lot of ducks lined up in a row, and already have been, or have this great network who can, bestow upon a pretty good amount of money, I think instead you have to take one step backwards to take 2 steps forward. And that's what I mean by all of this. Make a movie with your friends for $1,000 or even less, and put it on YouTube for free. And then say, okay, well now imagine what I could do if I had $10,000, $50,000, $100,000, $1 million, and you can go from there and you can keep moving up. At least that's what I think. But on this episode of the Dave Bullis Podcast, I have 2 producers who are absolute rock stars at coming up with all this stuff, and we're going to talk to them today. My first guest is Aaron Kaufman, a producer, writer, and director, best known for producing Machete Kills and Sin City 2 with Robert Rodriguez. And he also wrote and directed the film Urge starring Pierce Bronson. And my other guest, Brian Levin, is a producer and writer best known for Playing with Guns and Boys in Blue. They've just produced the new movie Flock of Dudes, which is out September 30th of this year, 2016. This is episode 128 with guests Aaron Kaufman and Brian Levin.
You're listening to the Dave Bullis Podcast.
Hey, Aaron. Hey, Brian. Thanks a lot for coming on the show.
Hey, how you doing?
Good, thank you, Brian. Aaron, how are you, sir?
Oh, doing well. Doing well. Thanks for having us.
Oh, well, my pleasure, guys. So, Brian, I just wanted to, I guess I'll start with you. I wanted to ask, and it's a question I ask everybody, and that question is, how did you get started in the film industry?
Started in the film industry. I started an online show in the fall of 2005 called The Post Show with two of the guys that I made the movie with, Bob Kester and Jason Zumwalt. And we started just by putting videos online twice a week, and that kind of got us into the industry.
So basically, were you discovered by that method, or did you sort of just parlay that into something else? Meaning that am I asking is, were you discovered by somebody, or did you self-fund your next project? What I was trying to ask.
Yeah, we were, through those videos, we were picked up for a company called Super Deluxe, which was an online network that was part of Adult Swim. And so they had, when they were starting off, they had talent scouts kind of come in the net for people like us, and that's how we were discovered.
Very cool. I was actually talking to the co-founder of The Onion, Scott Dickers, and that's how he was actually discovered. They were just doing The Onion as sort of like something to do, and it sort of, morphed into something else. And then, agents and managers were calling him and saying, hey, what else do you have? And it basically saying, because you guys are actually out there doing stuff. And it was a great way to to find out who's doing stuff, and and if they're able to get a network and able to get an audience, imagine what they could do if they had a little money behind them.
Yeah, exactly.
So, just to go to you now, Aaron, how did you get started in the film industry?
Well, I'm a little older, so there was no YouTube at the time. But my first job in entertainment was working for Chris Blackwell, who had started Island Records and Island Films, and I was sort of transitioning out of the .com world, which I worked in my early 20s, but always had wanted to work in entertainment, and got a chance to work with him as he was starting Palm Pictures. And it was kind of an interesting time and an interesting situation, because he was such a great guy and had this great experience having discovered Bob Marley and U2, and on the film side, having put out films by Spike Lee and Pedro Almodovar, and he just was this, Mandarin of all that was good as far as I was concerned. And so I got a chance to really get my feet wet and touch a lot of different parts of the business.
And that's very cool. As we talk about YouTube, I just wanted to mention, that's something that, I've had other producers on the show, and we've also talked about that, about, making your own YouTube show as sort of like a launch pad for yourself. And you know what I mean? And it's sort of about, the question that comes, as a lot of people have asked me through email and tweets and all that, is basically, well, how do you get the money to start your own YouTube show? So it's sort of like this cyclical question that, it's always like, the chicken or the egg, you know what I mean? It's always, where do you get the money?
And there's not always a the other part of it is if you want to become a doctor, that takes a lot of work, but there's a path that you go through. You do this, you take that test, you go to this school, you take these. There's a path. Here, there really is not, and I think that's what's really frustrating to a lot of people is you can't just tell them, oh, this is how this happened. I think if you ask Brian, did he expect to become a writer by dressing up as Bob Dylan and having a video go viral? He probably would not have. Probably was not part of his plan. So that's one thing, is that you have to understand it's really not about having a solid plan, but it is about creating things. So if you have an opportunity to create, and that's the strongest thing. I mean, even as a producer, as things are pitched to you or things come over, it doesn't have to be. I've seen really rudimentary stuff that you could just tell there's talent behind, and that's really enough. I remember before the first Paranormal Activity came out, there were agents showing that movie around to show off the directors, and it was even more rudimentary than the version that came out, but you could tell that there was significant talent there, and that's sort of how I would say I would worry a little less about having money to polish everything off and worry more about just making something that's engaging.
Yeah, it's very good advice, Aaron. Just as a quick side note, for my listeners who've listened to some of the past episodes, I actually shot my own TV pilot, and I was going to actually put it up on YouTube. And then I was talked out of it by an agent, and he said, "Don't ever put it." He's like, "No, don't put it on YouTube." He goes, "Let's just shop this thing around." And I didn't sign with that agent, by the way, but not that he really, but he was giving me advice at the time, and we ended up. I now am still toying with the idea of putting it up on YouTube, just because I basically, it cost me a hell of a lot more money than I thought it would, but you could tell that there was a lot of time and effort put into the production, the set design, everything, and I hate for it to just sit on a hard drive. You know what I mean? Of
course, I would say if it's something you're proud of, definitely put it out. There's something to what he was saying as far as being selective, and once you put something out there, then it's out there. So every time someone says, hey, we should hire this guy, know that is going to get looked at. As long as you're fine with that and you like it enough to be proud of it, to put it up there, to absolutely do that. But do know that you should be somewhat selective, because whatever's out there is out there, forever.
Yeah, very true. And as we talk about creating, I want to actually mention, Aaron, you have a movie out, Urge.
Yes.
And, you actually, wrote and directed, and I think you also produced Urge. And I wanted to ask, what was the impetus for you to start writing and directing your own script?
Well, Urge, actually, I wrote with Jason Zumwalt, who also wrote on with Brian. That's how I met Jason, with Brian on Flock of Dudes. He was part of the post show, and then I ended up doing early drafts with Jason, which really helped it to come together. But then ultimately wrote the last, I guess, 2 drafts with Jerry Stahl, who had written Permanent Midnight. So I had a lot of collaborators on the script, but I had always wanted to direct, and one of my reasons for taking the job with Robert Rodriguez in Austin in the first place was to learn production at that level. I had been producing for quite a while, but there was no comparison to the experience I got working down at Troublemaker, where we were making a movie every 9 months. And from just in the time I was there, we had done 2 Machete films, the sequel to Sin City, Spy Kids 4, and and Robert had produced the Predators remake with Adrian Brody. So it was nonstop production, and that helped me to really build up those chops. But once we had finished Sin City, which was a really large undertaking, it was really more a matter of trying to figure out what I wanted to direct and putting it together after that.
So I wanted to ask, you mentioned working with Robert Rodriguez, Aaron. I wanted to ask, what are some of the things that you learned from him in terms of either writing, production, directing? I mean, because I'm going to admit, I'm going to geek out here, Aaron. He's a huge idol of mine, and I mean, I am just, I would love the opportunity to talk to him, and I'm always interested in everyone that has worked with him. I've had his cousin on, Alvaro Rodriguez, who co-wrote Machete.
I like Alvaro.
and we were talking. I mean, I could, we were just geeking out about movies and everything else. But that's what I just wanted to ask you, Aaron. Is what are some of the things that you learned from working with Robert Rodriguez?
Well, it's a lot. I mean, it's probably its own dedicated show, because I think people don't realize he has sort of a whole theory of production, which is somewhat different than how everybody does things. So it's like it's almost like a master's class that you get from him. But some of the core tenets are the fact that, first and foremost, he likes to work, he likes to produce, and he produces a lot. And that in itself creates a different environment. And I would say that there's an analog to all people that are looking to put stuff on YouTube is, the way that you get great is by producing quite a lot. You're shooting all the time. You're getting acclimated to to what you can do, what's possible, and that really helps. The confidence you get from looking at a problem and knowing, oh, I know how to handle this. That's really important. And he did that. I mean, he was making shorts. He before he made Mariachi, he kind of approached Mariachi in a pretty methodical way, in the sense of he was getting ready for it like a marathon runner. So that's just producing a lot, I think, is one. Two, he also didn't really buy into the whole the mechanism of it all. If there was a better idea, if there was a way to do something more simply, he was all for that. And he also, if you look at him and Robert and Quentin, who are very good friends and came up together, they both have this sort of method, this sort of a thing that they live by, which is, they really are focused on what's going to be amazing, what's going to be memorable by an audience, and they really try to minimize everything that isn't. So, anything that's not, going to be memorable or going to be enjoyed by an audience, they really try to cut a lot of that stuff out of their movies, and that's why they're pretty lean and mean usually.
Yeah, I'm always fascinated about how quickly, Robert can get a movie together, and because I know he wants to make his, produce his own stuff, and there's something Robert once said about you have 20 bad movies in you, and basically get them out of you as quickly as you can, and that's why he made all those short films, early on in his life, where it was just he casted his friends and family, and just made videos like that, and just posted them. I think maybe a couple of his DVDs, I think he posted a few of the shorts on the DVD extras. But, I wanted to ask, Brian, when you were, coming up, did you start, did you do things like that, either in high school or in college? Did you actually make your own movies and just sort of, like make a ton of like really short movies and just try to get, a ton of mistakes out of the way?
Yeah, I did some short films and wrote some short films in high school and college, but I went to graduate school for a couple years for screenwriting, and I think that's kind of where I really just had like a high volume of output and really learned the craft that way.
Yeah, and just like Aaron said, I think the best way to actually learn is by doing, and that's even other filmmakers I've had on this podcast have even said that's what they did. They literally just took a camera out in their backyard, and just started making stuff. And one guy taught himself to edit by just taking a camera out to his local park. And basically okay, I'm gonna get some video, some footage of the ship coming in. I'm gonna get some footage of these birds. I'm gonna get footage of this. He wasn't focused on telling a story as much as he was just getting used to what's operating a camera, getting used to getting the right footage. You know what I mean? Like getting used to editing, all that stuff.
It's also, I think, writing is probably the biggest example of that, right? Because it's so terrifying to write. And the real antidote, to writing, or to being able to write, is more writing. So you have to start getting comfortable with, chopping the task down into smaller bites and saying, okay, you know what? I'm going to write this character. I'm going to write this line. I'm going to write something that you can do and complete and feel good about to move on, because it is daunting. But the truth is, the only way you get better is by doing.
Yeah, very true. And I want to talk to Aaron, as you were actually making Urge. what are some of the things that you took away? I mean, Urge looks amazing. It stars Pierce Brosnan. I've heard amazing things about working with Pierce, and I wanted to ask, what are some of the things that you learned while making Urge?
Tons. Pierce is great. I had worked with him once before on a movie called The Greatest, and had met him then, and was just very surprised with, he's 007, so you have one expectation meeting him, but he actually is just a super decent and really genuine guy. And that movie that I had produced there was a first-time director on that movie, and he was very kind and sort of very open to working with her, which is not something that every actor feels comfortable with. Sometimes that's a little scary for an actor to work with somebody who's a first-time filmmaker. I had produced films for 15 years, but still stepping behind the camera as a director for the first time, you're still a first-time director, no matter what. So I think that part of approaching Pierce in the first point was the fact that I knew what kind of guy he was, and that he would come and give his all, not undaunted by the fact that this was my first as a director. And then I learned with him that basically get someone as good as Pierce to read your dialogue, because it makes you sound like a much better writer if you do that. Because he just comes on stage and you're expecting one thing and he just did something so much better every single take, and so that was great. But you have to really learn to communicate. I think that's for directing. That is the biggest, and it may sound cliche, but it really is true. What ends up happening on a film set is directors get so, and I've seen this as a producer with first-time filmmakers, where filmmakers get so overwhelmed because they're being asked a million questions, and a lot of those questions they actually don't know the answers to, and they feel like they should, and that they start to break down and they start to just get nervous, and a lot of times they'll close down, and instead of giving more information, which is what they really need to do, they give less. And that's the really the biggest and the most fundamental lesson that I learned, and I would certainly talk with other filmmakers as I produce them to let them know, is that all these people want is to do the best job they can do. So you have to give them the tools to do it. So if they're asking you, this scene calls for a gun, what kind of gun do you want? And you actually don't know because you haven't thought about it, that's okay. You can tell them, I don't know, let me think about it. And that'll be better than, trying to just freeze up or not communicate.
That's a very good point, Aaron. One guy I've always heard who knows pretty much every answer that is asked to him is Tarantino. Some people I know that have worked with him have said that he already pretty much has anticipated all these questions, or his vision is either so deep that he already knows exactly what he wants, how it needs to look, all that stuff. And I think that really comes through in his movies.
I've known Quentin. I've never actually been on set with him, but I know him. I would definitely believe that he knows everything, just because he takes so much time and so much care, and he really almost writes his movies like novels. That by the time he gets on set, I would imagine that he just really, really knows. But even then, when you and as you do this more and more, you realize as you're writing that you're thinking about production in a way. Once you've directed, it changes your writing, because now you're thinking of, like, on the day, okay, I'm putting a gun in this guy's hand. What kind of gun is it going to be? Because you're going to get asked that question. If you're describing drapes, the idea of what color are those, or what texture are those, or those things. When you're first writing and you haven't directed before, a lot of times it's just, well, there's drapes, or there's this, or there's a gun, and you're moving on to the next thing without forcing yourself to really think through. I think that whether it's Quentin or some of the other, some other great directors that really, like a Paul Thomas Anderson or anybody who can create like a whole world, I think it's because they've thought through all that detail, and they've made that feel real, which helps the movie.
Yeah, I really felt that during Wes Anderson's Grand Budapest Hotel, because I even went out afterwards and I bought the book about the artwork of the film, and I mean, you could just tell the layer of planning and creativity in that film. I mean, because every shot literally looks like a painting.
Yeah, no, everyone's composed, and Wes is obviously known for for that level of almost like fetishistic detail. He also works with some of the best people in the world, and he cares. What I like about Wes, though, is that there are people that can get really overcome with the detail and forget to tell a story, or forget to really build characters. And he seems to be one of the few people that can kind of do all of those things. His films are so well composed, so well designed, and yet they always seem to have a heart to them. That's a really hard balance to make, and I think he does that very well.
Yeah, I completely concur. And as we talk about making and writing films, and I wanted to talk about the film that both of you produced, Flock of Dudes. Now, Brian, you also co-wrote the movie, if I'm correct, and you both produced the film. So, Brian, I wanted to ask, when what was the impetus for writing, Flock of Dudes? Was there any sort of event? Did you always have this idea? So what was the impetus of creating Flock of Dudes?
Yeah, that story just kind of came out organically from hanging out in New York with Bob and Jason, and we were, I guess, in our late 20s, mid to late 20s, and everybody was hanging out, and whenever we would go out, all the other kind of friends of ours would join us, and eventually there would be a dozen, guys going from bar to bar in New York. And we started joking around that we have to just break up with all these guys so we can get rid of them, so we're not traveling around in a flock of dudes. And that joke kind of became the movie.
So when you actually sat down, Brian, to write the film, was there do you subscribe to sort of any method to writing? Meaning, do you subscribe to Save the Cat? Do you or are you more of like a mini movie method guy, or do you just sort of just write?
Well, to be honest, it depends on what kind of movie I'm writing. So, some things are more structured in a conventional 3-act way, and some of them are more kind of a looser, less structured form. It just depends on the movie, really.
So with Flock of Dudes, when you sat down to write, since it was based, pretty much on your own experiences, did it sort of just flow out of you? Did you already know, like, hey, look, I know I want this to happen. I know by the end of the movie I want this to happen. Was it something like that?
I think we had a couple kind of big kind of plot points, like the guys breaking up with each other and things of that nature. But really, I think, at least with the group of people writing together, with 3 of us writing, it was just about sitting down and figuring out, hey, what are some interesting and funny things and characters, and then ultimately how can we kind of string this together into a story that makes sense and has a solid enough structure that it kind of fits into the realm of a commercial movie.
Right. Because I've had the writers of Broken Lizard on, and that's something that they were talking about as well, was that, they would get together, brainstorm an idea, and they wanted to make sure that there was actually a story there, you know what I mean? And they wanted to make sure that, they would put that the story and the structure would be like the bones, and then like all the jokes and everything would sort of be like the muscle and the skin, so to speak.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, Brian, I wanted to ask, how many drafts did you go through Flock of Dudes before you finally said, what, this is the draft, it's ready to shoot?
Between the very beginning, Flock of Dudes was a long process. It had been optioned by a studio and came back to us, and we had multiple drafts at every step of the way. But I would say probably overall, we probably did 30 drafts of it.
Wow. 30 drafts.
It was actually funny because they had been through sort of a studio development process, and so I came along after that, and I remember sitting with them working on the script, and no matter what you mentioned, they would say, "Oh yeah, this producer had suggested that before, or the studio wanted that before." Mm-hmm. To the extent where you're like, "What if all these characters were chickens instead of people?" They would be like, "Well, actually, the studio had mentioned that might be an idea," and so there was no end to how many permutations had been thrown at them. But I think it kept coming back to the original story, which was this, real relationship between these guys. And what I always liked about it was that it was a fun comedy with lots of big laughs in it, but at the core, it still felt real, and it still felt like it was rooted in, these real relationships. And I think that made it a lot more interesting for me.
And that's one thing that I think Aaron did very well, which we have encountered from time to time, but it's not all that common, which is he really recognized the core of the story, which is kind of essentially kind of the emotional journey of the lead character. And he helped us really kind of protect that and make sure, and he, encourage us to deliver on that. Stories are so, in the end, the story is so really fragile that there are a lot of ways that it can go sideways if you're not kind of protecting what's important about it.
Yeah, that's very true. And, this is something I've learned too, not from my own experience, but also from doing this podcast, is whenever a writer-director gets a producer, a piece, the singular sort of bonding element to all good relationships has always been that the producer sees that core of that script, and he or she actually really digs that idea. You know what I mean? They really understand one another, and that's so when the producer goes out and is talking to investors or going to distributors, that they can use that in the pitch and use that as the selling point, but also you know what I mean, like, so that way it's not that sort of what we were talking about before with all the different permeations where it's like, well, what if they were chickens? What if they were that? You know what I mean? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, I wanted to talk about, since we're talking about producing, I wanted to ask you guys, producing, Flock of Dudes, both of you produced this. And I wanted to ask, what were some of the biggest challenges in producing something like this?
I'm sorry, I missed the question.
What was some of the biggest challenges in producing Flock of Dudes?
I think Flock of Dudes, you're trying. There's a couple of things. One, you're trying to make a comedy in the independent space, which the independent space is not necessarily that welcoming of this kind of film. If you look at what really gets made in the indie space, it's dedicated toward, what we'll show at Sundance, what we'll show at Toronto. You don't really see sort of ribald comedies at those festivals. And we were really, at the end of the day, trying to make a commercial comedy that would be enjoyed, sort of outside of the indie space. That was sort of one challenge, because the people that are there, the systems that's there to help you and assist you through the process, there doesn't really exist. This is a kind of movie that would get made by a new line. And we were trying to make it look and feel and act like one of those movies, which is great, except that you're really on your own, because there's just not the sort of in the indie world for that. You don't have big festivals that want those kind of comedies. So that's one. Two, we're trying to make something that looks like a bigger budget movie on less of a budget, on a smaller budget. One of the things that we had lucked out on is the post-show guys had some great relationships in the comedy world, and we were able to populate the film with guys that people really liked. And then once that started to move, then other people started to come on board. That's where like Hilary Duff and Jamie Chung and even Ray Liotta were joining at that point, because we had Chris D'Elia and Brett Gelman and Kumail Nanjiani and all these other people that were really coming up. And this movie's we made it a little while ago, so I would say casting wise we look like geniuses, because now everybody who's in the film has kind of blown up and become huge. But that was those are the kind of 1-2 issues. And then you're dealing with Bob Castrone, who directed it, who's a first time as a director. So you're dealing with those that are not specific to Bob, but specific to anyone who's making their first film.
So, that's actually another producing question I had was, with a cast like that, how because they're all doing so many things. Hannah Simone, she's on New Girl. You have Eric Andre, you have Hilary Duff. What was some of the biggest logistic issues? Just getting all those actors together. Or was there any logistic issues?
There was. I mean, there was a lot of just the casting of it. We ended up normally in a film as a producer, I'm casting directly 3 or 4 roles, that are your sort of bigger roles, and then working with a casting director to come up with ideas for everybody else. Here, we really kind of cast down almost the entire movie. So other than background, there are no like day players on the movie. Everybody in the film is somebody great. Not that day players can't be great, but these are every single role is populated by somebody who we loved and was really great. So you have Jeff Ross in a scene. You have Kellen Coleman. You have Timothy Simons from Veep in a really funny scene. So there's the movie kind of just keeps going and going. And for producing wise, we were really excited every day almost, because it was like every day we got to work with somebody new and that we admired. Hannibal Buress, and it just went on and on. So it was that made it pretty fun. But doing that was done as a concerted effort, because it was a matter of how do we make this movie stand out? How do we make this movie look special? And that was one of our big ways of doing it.
Aaron, you mentioned that this was Bob Castrone's, directorial debut. When investors were looking at the movie, did they ever, maybe question, should we, is Bob going to be able to handle this? I don't mean it the way it sounds, by the way. I just mean that, is there ever a sort of an issue that someone would raise? We're saying like, well, hey, is there anybody else? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I don't mean it the way it sounds.
No, it's not at all. No, and in fact, it's exactly what happens. I mean, having nothing to do with Bob specifically, just the moment you say first-time filmmaker to an investor, it's that it's not what they want to hear. No one ever grabs you and says, "Oh, great, that's exactly what I wanted." First-time director to lavish my money on. And look, the same thing went for me, because after Flock of Dudes, I directed Urge, and I thought, having been in film for so long and having worked on big movies like Sin City, that being a first-time director would not be as much of a hindrance, but it still is, and really what it comes down to, and I understand it a little bit better now, is that before you direct, you really have no idea what kind of director you're going to be. You could hope, you can think, you can prepare, you can learn, you can watch movies, you can take classes, you can learn theory. All of these things are what you should do, which is great, but none of them really prepare you for what it's actually like. And I've seen it. I've seen people that get behind the camera and they just freeze, and it's not for them. And I've seen people get behind it who you weren't necessarily thinking were going to be great, and they thrive. So that because that's a random, that's why I think people get really nervous about it, is because there's nothing to prepare. You're essentially trusting a producer who says, yes, this person can do this job. So you have to overcome that. In a lot of ways, we overcame that was the who we had on to produce the movie, who we brought on cast wise to really offset the studios.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you because that's what I was trying to say, Aaron, was that basically, even when, in my own experience, when, you put something together like a pitch packet and you go to investors, that's not something they want to hear, first time director, you know what I mean?
Yes.
Because, they sort of, they want to know who, and I forget who I was saying this to, but that's sort of what the new thing is, where it's like, even for, for any independent film now, it's like, we want a named director, a named producer, a named writer, even, and the cast all has to be sellable. So, get us people, you know what I mean? And it's sort of putting this whole package deal together so it's sort of like you're stacking the deck, so that when you go to producers when you go to investors, that you can say, look, we're pretty much stacking the deck in your favor, because everyone here is willing to work for a little less maybe, or, is willing to work on this passion project.
You're 100% right. And for me, it makes it a lot less fun than it used to be. I mean, you always had to put a package together, but now in order to get something off the ground, you have to, it used to be, okay, we have one major star who wants to make this movie and it's a smaller movie, let's go. Now it's like, okay, well, the first and second lead and third and maybe fourth, and we need a name director. And then all of a sudden, in my mind, you're taking a lot of what's special about indie film in the first place. I grew up in the 90s, and that's when I think New York indie film was really kind of at its height, and you had great Kids, and you had all these great Simple Men, and all these other great movies that were coming out, and you had Jim Jarmusch, and those guys were not making those movies thinking that they needed 5 main stars to make those movies, and I don't know that their films would have been as special if they did. So I do think I understand it, because I understand the financing side of things, and I understand why they're looking for that. But I would venture to say that the most successful independent films are the ones where artistry is really at the forefront.
I had on Chris J, who from Army of Freshmen, and he actually made a movie called The Bet. And what they did was they actually crowdfunded a little bit of money, and actually took that money sort of as like a seed investment, and they actually went out to find more money through actual investors. And because they actually had to basically. That's sort of like the new model, as he was saying, because that way he could, use that to go out and fly to meet these people or have these meetings, or that they finally got the money, and then they, if you watch The Bet, it has like Jake the Snake Roberts, has Roddy Piper in it, you know what I mean? Like those, like we were just saying, they're sprinkled throughout the whole movie.
Yeah, I mean, I personally don't really know how the crowdsourcing stuff works. I'm interested in it. I've seen some good stuff happen from it. But yeah, I mean, a lot of filmmaking is about momentum. And so anything that you can use to get momentum going. So if, a lot of times I would raise, seed money, or we'd raise development money for a film. If you could do that through crowdsourcing, that would give you the momentum that you need. And once you have momentum, then people start to pay attention. If you say, look, we're going to make this movie maybe, or we're going to make this movie in October, it's very different. It's very different for agents, and it's very different for a cast to wrap their head around trying to come on board.
Aaron, if you ever have any questions about crowdfunding, I will be more than happy to answer any questions you may have.
Oh, great.
Because I've done it a number of times. I've helped other filmmakers raise budgets, all that good stuff. So I even wrote a couple articles about it, which actually one of them is on Indie Film Hustle with Alex Ferrari, whom you were on the podcast on.
I did. Yeah.
So it was on his site. So it's So if you ever have any questions, please let me know.
Great.
So, guys, I had some fan questions come in. Would you mind answering a few?
No, sounds great.
My first question comes in from the Good People Podcast Reviews, which is at the Hypocritics. As the film was mentioned on WTF Podcast with Mark Maron as being delayed, what issues did you encounter?
Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Sure, no problem. As the film was mentioned on WTF podcast with Mark Maron as being delayed, what issues did you encounter?
Yeah, I think it was he was talking to Eric Andre. The film itself, we put together, and it was put together at a fairly small budget, and then we cut the film. I was, like I said, I was directing Urge, and was able to then kind of right before that come back and work with Bob on another cut. And then really it was just the vagaries of the current indie space. We weren't looking to go. We were very proud of the film, and we were looking for the right partner for it. And so we had been approached by a bunch, but their ideas for bringing it out just were not aggressive enough. And then we were lucky enough to connect with stars who have been great to us and have a really great idea for bringing the movie out and doing it theatrically as well as VOD, and then a partner with Hulu. So the movie will get a much broader imprimatur than it would have. And I think holding out for the right situation was the best idea. Then after that, they had a schedule of when the movie would fit in the queue, which took some time as well. But yeah, I think it's been something, because I think a lot of the cast, and myself included, were really happy and proud of the film, and really liked it, wanted to see it come out, and the waiting has been a little bit of a bummer. But we've reached out now to cast, and they're all coming back on board to help promote it now, which has been great.
And that there's another question that came in, which actually ties in to what we were just talking about, is, do you find it harder to release a film now because the marketplace has gotten a little bit more crowded?
Aaron?
Yeah, I think so. But I don't know that it's as crowded as it is. There are other options. You know, I think it's you saw gluts in the independent film world a few times, right? I think 2006-07 was probably one that I can remember specifically because it was like there were a lot of good movies that came out, and we were dealing with a flush of money that hit the independent market, mostly from hedge funds, and it was just creating too much product that couldn't be absorbed. Now, I don't know if it's that. I don't know if that's the issue. I think the issue is just what are our behaviors. I think our behaviors have changed, which is in some ways scarier, because I think our behaviors used to be, great, it's Friday night, I'm going to go on a date, let's go watch a movie. Now you literally have people say things like, let's Netflix and chill, right? Which is a completely different sort of mindset. And I think that's pervasive. So I think people now are looking for more stuff that they can binge watch, more stuff that they can see. I think people are enjoying watching, something that's more in depth, like 10 episodes of Narcos. And so I think that the amount of time people want to spend in the theater is less, and so therefore it's got to be more special. The corollary is that you have the studios that are putting movies out there that know that the only way to really get people's attention is to spend quite a lot of money. And so the amount of films that they're willing to make that kind of risk on is really gone. So what you're seeing less and less of are what I kind of grew up understanding, which was like that platform release where you're putting it on 5 screens is doing well. You're putting it on 10, you're putting it on 50, you're putting it on 100, you're making your way to 1,000. You're seeing that happen less and less. So you either have big movies like, Marvel films that come out in 4,000 screens, or you're seeing, something come out on 2 screens and then go to VOD. The world has changed, and that's made it more and more difficult for producers.
Yeah, and that's something I've noticed as well. Is that it is really you sort of have to make those projections, right? You sort of that's why we were talking about sort of stacking the deck in our favor. You have to make those projections that this is how if we could sell it on VOD, if we can sell it through our website, if we can get on iTunes, get an aggregator, all that stuff.
Well, yeah, but the one thing I would say and I would reinforce is indie film in some ways hurt itself. Going back to that time, 2006, 7, 8, there were a lot there was a lot of money that was flush, and instead of producers saying, okay, let's find the right movies, people were grabbing projects that had been on shelves for years and saying, well, let's make this. And so there was great stuff that came out at that time, but there was also a ton of stuff that was either not good or just wasn't yet ready to be put out there. So that's the other thing is, for now, you have multiple ways of getting to people, and even having someone see your movie on Netflix is not the worst thing in the world. But what are you doing? When they do find you, are you doing anything new and interesting? Because that's what I think people will gravitate towards. If it's French miniseries, but if it's amazing, people are finding it on Netflix. I think that's a good thing. But I think that puts the onus on the filmmaker to not just make a movie, but to make something that's has a reason for being today.
Yeah, that's a good point, Aaron. And actually I have one final question that came in, and basically it is, what would you recommend for a first-time producer making a film?
Run away. Look,
best answer.
The more that the more you have, for one thing, you have to work harder than anybody else, and you have to get that out there. People need to see that you're willing to be, as aggressive, more aggressive than anybody else, because momentum is really what makes a movie. People look at you when you have a script and you're trying to peddle a script around town. You have a script, and it may be great, it may not be, but that's how they view you. If you have a movie, meaning you have this thing up and running, you guys are going to go on October 12th, it changes things. That's completely creates a new dynamic. And so the point at which, as a producer, your goal is not to get a script funded by somebody, because that happens so infrequently. What you have to do is start adding the elements, right? So you have to look at, who do I know? Who can I get to? Who can help me? And you have to not be afraid to go and try to bring those people on board. And so you have to think of it almost like you're keeping plates in the air spinning at all times, you're running to, if you're going to not direct it, you got to find the director for it. If you don't know a name director, you don't have somebody who you can bring on who adds value per se, find the most talented person you can find that you can get behind. You can show, look, this movie is not just a great movie, but I'm going to bring this incredible piece of talent to the world. And then as you're starting to talk to talent, you have a great script with a really impressive filmmaker, and don't you want to be a part of this? And so you're always running the table, and you kind of always have to do these things simultaneously. It's a lot of work, and I think people that have an impulse to make a film sometimes don't always understand that the amount of work and sort of how grueling it can be. You can't just approach it sequentially where I'm going to bring a script to somebody, he's going to give me a bag of money, I'm then going to go spend that money on great talent, and then we're going to make a genius movie and then go collect, Academy Awards. It just doesn't really work that way. It really is a game of trying to build momentum. And the more you build, the better your movie can attract talent, and hopefully the better movie you'll be able to make.
There's a piece of producing advice that someone once gave me, and basically all the resources come down to time and money. Either you need more time or you need more money. But they said you could spend time to get more money, but you can't spend money to get more time, sort of thing.
Right.
So
it's true. I mean, I've been on, I've seen that before, where, you think you have all the money in the world, and so therefore that should equal better movie, and it doesn't always. So I think that no matter where you are, and that was a lesson I learned working with Robert Rodriguez, was he wasn't always looking at like how much money could I possibly get to make this movie. Quite the contrary, he would, if he could get $40 million to make a Spy Kids movie, he'd make that movie for 30, because he was always trying to outsmart the production, try to deal with less, and also in that scenario he would always have a little bit more autonomy, because the onus was far less than if he had made it for $50 million. So money doesn't always buy quality. If it did, then every big Warner Brothers and Fox movie would be amazing. But it's not. That said, on the indie front, I think that you're still competing in a way with those larger movies, and so you have to invest in something else. You don't have CG, you don't have these huge implementations, but what you can have is style, and what you can have is story and great character, and something that's going to pop. And so you could put a movie like Black Swan into the same mix as the Avengers, and it will do well because it's different enough and it's engaging enough.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. And Aaron, just to sort of add one final thought to that, as we talk about making films and producing our first films, one popular method I've heard from a lot of guests that I've on this podcast, and even from reading books, particularly Stu Makowitz's book, basically it's creating that Rodriguez list, and it's basically creating that, find out what you have access to, and then you build a script around that. So if you know what I mean, if you have grandma's house and you can use the basement, shoot something in that basement. If you have an old Studebaker that's sitting somewhere, try to find a way to put that in the script as well.
For sure. Yeah, and I think I would extend that to include relationships as well. Who do you know? Who do you have access to? Who can help you? Who can introduce you to this person or that person? And do that. But more importantly, at the end of the day, the piece that people forget sometimes is, do you have something you're passionate about? Do you have a movie that you really want to tell? Because a lot of this stuff is details. A lot of this stuff is, the how. And I think you got to figure out the why. And that's what hurts a lot of movies, is you have the how, like, oh, I wanted to make a movie and I figured out how to do it. That's great, and I appreciate that. But at the same time, you really need to start from the why, which is, I have this piece of material that is going to be so funny, or it's so interesting, or so engaging, that I have to get it out there, and that's generally a better place to start.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Aaron. But it is about who you know, right? This whole industry is about relationships, and it is always about who you know, right? Guys, we've been talking for about 49 minutes now. So in closing, is there anything that we didn't talk about that you may wanted to discuss, or sort of any sort of final thoughts that you'd like to add to this conversation? Just sort of put a period at the end of this whole thing?
I know Brian wanted to wait on the election, right, Brian?
No, for sure. I've been, studying up, and I think I've got it all figured out. Who's going to win and everything. So, no, I would say, kind of big picture is a little bit what we've all been circling around, which is there is the movie you have in your mind, which is in your imagination. There is the reality of life. You have to deal with the reality while trying to execute this vision. So that's across the board, whether you're dealing with resources, money, actors, locations, anything. Don't be an artist who has an aversion to reality. This is not going to help you make a movie. You'll do what you do, but you're not going to make a movie. So, even though it's an unpleasant reality, often better that than not. That's that's what I've kind of learned essentially.
Yeah, and you're right, Brian. That is something. I sometimes think you have to pick and choose battles, right? You know what I mean? You can pick and choose battles, but just as long as you win the war, type of. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So Aaron, is there any sort of final thoughts that you have to sort of appear in this whole conversation?
Just that Flock of Dudes comes out on September 30th, and comes out in theaters and on iTunes. We're really happy with the movie, and I hope everybody enjoys it.
And everyone, I will link to Flock of Dudes in the show notes. I will link to all the good stuff about the movie. I will link to everything we talked about. Brian, where can people find you out online?
The website for me and the guys is thepostshow.com, and you can find some sketches that we had done kind of leading up to Flock of Dudes, and also just some other information about us.
Cool. Are you on Twitter or Facebook or anything?
No, I'm on Facebook. I'm not on Twitter. So.
Okay, cool. And Aaron, where can we find you out online?
I'm on Twitter at @A_Kaufman, Kaufman on Twitter, and I think I'm Aaron K. Kaufman on Instagram.
Cool. And I will link to that in the show notes as well. Aaron, Brian, I want to say thank you very much for coming on. I wish you the best with Flock of Dudes. Everyone, DaveBullis.com, Twitter, it's @Dave_Bullis. Guys, I look forward to seeing Flock of Dudes.
Thanks,
and whatever
Dave. Thanks for having us.
Oh, my pleasure, guys.
Thank you.
I wish you the best.
All right, thanks.
My pleasure, buddy. Take care, guys.
Find Dave at davebullis.com. Please make sure to subscribe and share the podcast.